of Global Education, Deidre Johnston has been a faculty member at Hope College since 1994. She developed the college's Peace and Justice Studies minor and chaired the Department of Communications from 2003 to 2010. She's co-author of the Wiley Handbook for Online Collaborative Learning and Global Engagement. She's also a co-founder of the Intergroup Dialogue Connections. She received a BA in journalism from Drake University, an MA in journalism advertising from the University of Texas, and a PhD in communication studies from the University of Iowa. Take it away, Deidre.
All right, thank you so much, Judy. Good morning, HASP. It is a pleasure to be with you again and to see your faces and to actually see faces below the nose is always quite exciting for me these days. I'm delighted to be here, and I think we have a topic for the next 5 weeks that is critically important as we approach this election and even post-election. What do we do after the election? I think the partisan divides and divisions in our country are not going to magically go away after the November election. So how do we engage civility? How do we engage in conversations with those with whom we disagree and with whom our values differ? So that's what we're going to be spending our time with for the next 5 weeks. And as part of this, we're going to spend less time talking about the theoretical writings and philosophies of civility, and we're going to spend more time talking about the communication skills that you might be able to use in order to engage in productive conversations and dialogues around difficult issues that face us today. Because I truly believe, in my opinion, that we have got to have dialogue. We have to have conversation about these issues in order to save our democracy. That's what our democracy is based on, and I'm not sure we're doing such a great job of it at the moment, but that is purely my opinion. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen with you. So give me just a moment while I do a couple of clicks here. And Judy, I'm just going to check with you that you are indeed, there we go, seeing my screen.
Yes, I am.
Excellent. Okay, so I was playing around with various titles for this series, and this idea of cultivating civil community in an age of incivility and uncivil unrest seemed to kind of pinpoint where we are at this moment. Incivility is being rude, right? Uncivil means being uncivilized or barbaric. That we're losing this sense of civilization and cooperative community. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So the first visual I have up for you is an art installation in Canada that just caught my eyes. It's called The Screaming Heads. And I don't know about you, but I know that anymore, that's what I feel like I'm living in the middle of, is a bunch of screaming heads when it comes to politics. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time this morning talking about the incivility of our present age, the pundits who scream and interrupt each other on talk shows, the rhetoric of our politicians that dishonors members of our community, the media looking for the next shaming headline, the snarky comments and blatant generalizations that are retweeted and shared on social media, the political divide on social issues that have divided our country, our workplaces, our schools, and even made Thanksgiving dinner with Uncle Vinny immensely uncomfortable, and the messages that erupt from the divides of the American church that threaten to split our denominations. So we all know it, we all live it. Let's talk a little bit more about how we got here. I'm going to introduce a term called zealous identity group loyalty. It is an awkward term. I used to use the term tribalism when I talked about this, and indeed you'll find many books on the market on bestseller lists labeled tribalism in the title. I was giving a presentation to a group about a year ago now, and someone made me aware that that term is very offensive to First Nations people. So I have jettisoned that term and try not to use that, because we are using the term tribalism and associating it with negative connotations about divisions and between group tension and violence and hatred. So I can understand why First Nations people really don't want to be saddled with that connotation yet again. So for lack of a better term, we're going to play around with zealous identity group loyalty. A little awkward, but it's going to work for us. And what this does is we need to understand about how we psychologically think about in-groups and out-groups. So I want to give you an example from my mother. So outside of her familial relationships, my mother had two primary identities. My mother was a devout Presbyterian who traced her lineage back to John Knox and the Reformation. I kid you not. She was also a loyal Republican who traced her partisan heritage back generations. And she would often, frequently, and proudly proclaim, "Our family has and always will be Presbyterian and Republican." I am, I fear, a great disappointment to my mother, but that's another story. My mother remained throughout her life highly skeptical of all other Protestants, including the Methodists, whom she disclaimed for putting vegetables into their Jello salad. Sacrilege, to be sure. And the Lutherans, who she claimed sang egregiously off key. So this idea of zealous identity group loyalty is the idea that we defend our own identity groups and we tend to denigrate others who are outside of our own group. So we do this with our national heritage, our racial, our ethnic heritage, our religious heritage. The list goes on about the in-groups identities that we claim and how we differentiate ourselves from those outside of our group. Now, this can be okay if we support a sports team with zealous identity group loyalty, that's okay. But when we start using rhetoric that is derogatory to people outside of our group, and we start generalizing and dehumanizing and demonizing people outside of our group, we've crossed a line. So how did we get here? Perhaps it all starts with the Jello, right? It's kind of a silly analogy, but I think a helpful one. So you've got Jello with vegetables in it. A value is associated with that, vegetables. An evaluation of that value is associated with that. Yuck, don't like vegetables in my Jello salad. And then we generalize to all vegetable Jello salad eaters as somewhat less than those who make other culinary choices. Okay, so writ large, that's what we're doing on a larger political scale. Now, don't want to minimize this because clearly we have contested values at stake here. There is a conflict of values, make no mistake about it, and that is difficult. But what we're going to do over the course of this series is talk about how can we disagree with someone's values, disagree or challenge their position on an issue, but still hold that other person as a sacred person who deserves dignity and respect, that we respect the person. You don't have to appreciate someone's position on an issue. And I'm not asking you to compromise your positions. I'm asking you to separate the positions from the person. How can we hold people who disagree with us in a sacred way? How can we honor them as people? Because people are complex. They have many values. So though you may disagree with someone on one value, you might not disagree with them on all values. People are complex. They hold many roles. They are grandparents. They are parents. They are children. They are a favorite aunt. They are a dentist. They are a professor. They are a custodian. They are a factory worker. They hold many roles. People are complex and there are many dimensions to people. And what gets us into trouble is when we essentialize a complex person to their partisan identity or to their position on a particular issue. So we're going to talk about in this series over the next few weeks, not how to change your values, but how to change your view and how you communicate with people who may not share your values. So Hobbes writes about civility and notes that the mere act of disagreement is always offensive. And it's at some level an insult to someone else. So you disagree with me. Implication is I must be stupid, because if I weren't stupid, I could only understand the facts of immigration if I could just perceive the complexities of the situation of abortion. If I just had the good and righteous morals and values and insight to God that you have, I would think just like you. Am I wrong? Trick question. If you thought, yes, she's wrong, you probably think I'm stupid, and that just proves my point. So Teresa Began wrote a book called Mere Civility. And in it, she argues that in a democracy, we are committed to tolerating disagreement. We necessarily create a society of potential mutual loathing and contempt, because we say that all voices must be heard. All voices must be represented in our democracy. This in turn makes civility absolutely necessary to sustain democracy. Now, civility gets a bad rap sometimes. Some argue that we are past the time to be civil because they're so fed up with how things are going. How can we possibly talk about civility with those people who hate, oppress, and incite violence? And again, that's the argument that's made on both sides of the partisan divide about the other side. It's almost the exact same rhetoric. Those who hate, oppress, and incite violence. So our very democracy and the continuation of our democracy depends upon our ability to engage civility, to live in community with each other and live in the midst of disagreement, because that is part of what a democracy is. Incivility is dangerous. This is a famous sculpture taken from a photograph of Desmond Tutu during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And he was in the midst of the hearings. He put his head down on the table and he just started to sob. We know from other countries and other contexts that when we start dehumanizing other people, it can lead to violence. It is the first step to lead to violence. We know that hate rhetoric is dangerous. We have the examples from South Africa, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, Sudan, Myanmar, Wuhan in China, and most recently Armenia, just in the last few weeks. I did an exercise with my students last week, and at one level, it wasn't surprising what the outcome was, but at another level, it has haunted me and been just in my thoughts for the past week. So I was doing an exercise and I was asking them to respond on a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree on particular statements regarding the election and politics and political discourse. One of those statements was, do you believe that we will have violence following this upcoming election? 100% of the students in my class, who vary on a spectrum of Democrats to Republicans and everybody in between, 100% said they strongly agree. That, my friends, is our democracy at stake. That to me is a very frightening thing. This is a cartoon. Zapiro is a famous cartoonist in South Africa. And this is a depiction of Desmond Tutu during the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions after apartheid, with the skulls and the stories of the atrocities that occurred during apartheid. And Desmond Tutu is saying, oh God, help us to remember that the people who did this are also your children. And God shouts back through the clouds, let me get back to you on that one. So, where are we as we start our series together? I'll share my two epiphanies as I think about this topic. First, what we're called to do is really difficult stuff. When you follow the gospel, Christian virtues, living faithfully according to any major world religion, or living as a secular humanist, honoring the human dignity of all, and call out those people for their incivility. Well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but in my study of civility, not the cheap civility, but the real stuff, reveals that we have to act civilly. It's not them, it's us. The change has to come from us. Civility comes from within ourselves, not from outside someone else. So as some of you who know me know, I'm married to a psychiatrist and I have a daughter who is a therapist. God help me, everything I do is analyzed. But the one thing that I've learned from this is that you cannot lead people where we are not where we are let me try that again. You cannot lead people where we are unwilling to go ourselves. So we have to be the first step if we're calling for civility. It has to come from us. And by changing interactions, changing conversations within our communities and our groups, we can change a culture. Finally, as a last warning before we go any further, so you can go grab the life raft if you need to, but there's no way to talk about civility in these divisive times without talking about some of the divisive issues that we face. I may offend you, I make you feel uncomfortable, but that's okay. Because when we're engaging in civility, when we're really engaging and reaching out to people who share different values than we do, we should be uncomfortable. Engaging in civility requires us to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. Because we can sit with our discomfort and we can use that to learn, to grow, to move forward, and we don't have to essentialize it to the person. Somebody can have a value or position that differs from mine, and it doesn't mean that I like them any less or I respect them any less. They have a value or a position that I don't like, but it doesn't mean I don't like the person. So part of our process is going to be dealing with and sitting with our discomfort. I'm going to approach our conversation over the next few weeks with a virtues framework. And a virtue can be defined as a disposition to do good, and it's considered a foundation for community and civilization. Indeed, to be uncivil is to be without a foundation of common good and collaborative living, and that is to be barbaric, to be without a foundation of common good for collaborative living. So where do our virtues come from? There are many lists and they've been adopted
still on?
from various different people. Aristotle came up with 12 virtues: courage, temperance, liberality, generosity, magnificence, ambition, patience, friendliness, truthfulness, wit. I love that wit was a virtue, according to Aristotle, modesty, and from Aristotle or from the Wisdom of Solomon, a book which didn't make it into the Christian Bible. And those cardinal virtues are prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. And to those, St. Paul adds 3 Christian virtues: hope, faith, and love. Pope Gregory in the 6th century came up with the 7 deadly sins. And someone probably suggested to poor Pope Gregory that perhaps if he were going to preach on these things, that maybe he needed to have some more motivational, positive aspirations. And so he came up with 7 virtues. And those virtues are chastity, makes the list for the first time specifically, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. So we've got lots of lists of virtues. They've coming from numerous sources. There's a lot of overlap, and sometimes a different word is used, but really is kind of getting at the same idea. So we're going to play with the following virtues over the next 4 upcoming weeks, this week and the next 4 weeks: the courage to speak, the humility to listen, loving ourselves in order to love others, temperance in conflict, and fortitude in justice, wisdom to question, faith in uncertainty, hope for reconciliation, and liberality to act in the name of goodness, virtue, and justice. So today, those are our 5 topics over the next few weeks for this series. Today, we're going to focus on the courage to speak and the humility to listen. So courage is the boldness to accept the risks associated with honest advocacy of one's own position. Courage requires the strength to freely speak one's convictions, even when one's opinions may be unpopular. So we have a moral obligation to speak up, to speak our truth. Humility recognizes the limitations of any one person's knowledge and thus makes it possible to learn from the insights of others. If we go into conversations thinking that we already know everything, there's no possibility for growth and transformation and change. Humility says no to the pride that prevents open communication, thus encouraging a willingness to consider carefully others' opinions and perspectives. Humility does not mean, however, that you have to endorse every view that you encounter. You can still hold true to your own values and positions and practice humility. So, this is a complex topic. When we look at civility, when we look at this model, it involves all of these things. It is at the intersection of community. It is required for us to live in community. Civility without justice is authoritarianism. So justice has to be a part of our understanding of civility. Civility affects our very relationships, from the smallest relationships with our most intimate others, and we practice it there so that we're able to extend that circle and extend and expand who we consider our neighbor and who we engage with our in-group and our civility with. Civility requires leaning into conflict and not being scared of conflict or something we run away with, but something we lean into, because that's an opportunity for growth. That's an opportunity for transformation. That's an opportunity for productive change. If we're not challenged by conflict and being a little uncomfortable, we're probably not going to grow, learn anything, or change. Civility has to be connected with truth. We have to be authentic and honest in our communication, and we have to demand honesty and truth from others. And I would say in our current situation right now, we need to reclaim truth, and we need to hold people accountable to truth, to facts, because it is necessary for, again, that community of divergent opinions and perspectives to bond together. We have to have some accountability to truth. And it all involves communication, that we communicate effectively, that we listen effectively, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about civility is the courage to speak. I want to introduce you to Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. Baal Shem Tov led a group of followers, and he must have really enjoyed quiet and maybe a lot of introspection in his life, because he conveyed to his followers that you're not limited by God to a certain number of days that you have to live. You are limited to a certain number of words. It's as if the word, that number is written on your forehead. You don't know what it is. And every time you use up a word, you're that much closer to your end time. So he probably had a fairly quiet, judiciously, a group who used their words judiciously. So I want to just keep that in mind in terms of thinking about choosing our words wisely, trying to speak concisely and choosing our words wisely. We use hurtful language, harsh tones, cynical judgments, ill-founded arguments when we do not take the time and effort to choose our words wisely. Another part of the courage to speak is using words that empower, that lift up other people. This is a responsibility that I believe that we have. It's taking the minimal effort to learn and use language that does not belittle others, and to respond with grace when others make mistakes and use language that belittles us. Belittle is to make less than, and there are various ways in which we use language in these ways. When we say she is handicapped, we reduce the person's entire identity to an ability. When we say she is visually, physically, mentally impaired, it defines a person's multiple identities in terms of deficit. Some words pick up negative connotations over time, and it's our responsibility to keep up with that, to learn about that, and to learn to choose our words carefully so they are not offensive to others. So in the past, you may have said that's just retarded, or he is retarded. It's our responsibility to change and adapt our language as we come to realize how hurtful that language has been and continues to be to other people. Sometimes it's difficult because we do not have the language to replace that, and we do not speak this new language fluently. But it again is our responsibility to learn, to educate ourselves when we make mistakes, to say, admit, apologize, I made a mistake. I'm trying to keep up with this language change. I'm trying to be respectful. Help me to learn to speak this more fluently. Sometimes language changes may seem even silly to us or trivial to us, but we have not suffered the daily indignities of the belittling labels, names, barbs, jokes that others have endured. And it's a pretty minimal request to uplift the dignity of another person by using words that empower others. I want to shift now to a little video clip I'm going to show you from Maya Angelou, where she talks about beautifully, poetically, as she always does, about the power of words. So bear with me just a moment while I switch screens on you. Oh, great, we get an ad. There we go.
Words are things, I'm convinced. You must be careful about the words you use, or the words you allow to be used in your house. In the Old Testament, we are told in Genesis that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. That's in Genesis. Words are things. You must be careful. Careful about calling people out of their names, using racial pejoratives and sexual pejoratives and all that ignorance. Don't do that. Someday we'll be able to measure the power of words. I think they are things. I think they get on the walls. They get in your wallpaper. They get in your rugs, in your upholstery, in your clothes, and finally into you.
Okay, just going to check in with Judy. If you can give me a thumbs up, we'll be back on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, we're seeing screen.
All right, perfect. Everything worked seamlessly. You never know with technology these days. Some of you may have seen this quote has come back in popularity during this election season in the United States, a quote from Martin Luther King that says, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." And so I want to talk about speaking our truth and how with civility, it is important that we speak our truth. We state our position. Having courage to articulate our truth, our positions, our values, our beliefs, even when it might be unpopular to do so. So I will give you a very personal example. There was a time when I remained silent, and it has haunted me for decades. Those who know me well in this group might even question that was ever the case, that I was silent, but there are times that I have not spoken when I should have. And one when it was when I was a child. I was a victim of sexual abuse. And because I did not speak my truth, I did not speak out against this predator. This person was a predator that preyed on other children as well who were victimized. So civility is speaking our truth, personally, interpersonally, and within our communities. Now, Martin Luther King, when he said there comes a time when silence is betrayal, was giving a speech about the Vietnam War. But even taking this out of the context in which he originally said it, I think his statement, it speaks to us at this particular time. He goes on to say, after he says, there comes a time when silence is betrayal, and says, and some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speech is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. And I think that speaks to us that it's not always easy to have the courage to speak, but it is important to have the courage to speak. So one of the things as we think about speaking is asking ourselves, whose story is it to tell? Civility is about telling our own story and not speaking for other people. A friend has graciously given me the permission to use this very personal example with you today. The friend and I were traveling internationally with a group of university faculty, and she privately asked one of the local facilitators in the country where we were about access to a clinic where she could get a pregnancy blood test. The facilitator made the arrangements and then dramatically announced to the entire group gathered for this conference, which also included the woman's co-workers, supervisors, and said, "Oh, we are so excited. She is with baby." We could perhaps chalk this up to cultural differences, but this was not the local facilitator's story to tell. My friend subsequently miscarried and had to email all of the people that were present for this announcement, which she would never had to have done if her story had not been disclosed in the first place. So there are various ways in which we tell other people's stories. We also tell people's stories. We write and tell the stories about people with races, ethnic identities, gender identities, sexual identities, political partisan values that are different from our own. We try to write their stories. We try to tell their stories. Not only do we not understand their stories, but we have no moral right to be the spokesperson for those stories. So just a quick review, this courage to speak, to choose our words wisely, use words that empower other people, speak our truth, and ask ourselves, whose story is it to tell? I want to shift our focus a little bit to humility to listen. What does it mean to have humility to listen? Humility is a tough virtue, isn't it? People who write, philosophers who write about humility and theologians writing about humility in the Christian tradition talk about humility as the meta virtue. This is a virtue that you've got to have before you can work on any of the rest of the virtues. If you don't have humility, you have no foundation upon which to develop these other virtues in your life. And it's an interesting way to think about humility, to kind of turn it upside down. Sometimes we think of humility as being powerless and being submissive and giving in. But humility, and I've got the armor suit there for your visual, actually protects your ego, your esteem, your worldview, because engaging in a moral disagreement is not a threat. If I'm engaging in this discussion, this conversation with somebody who differs from me, and it's not threatening to me, I'm confident in my courage to speak, and I want to listen, I want to understand their perspective, then I don't have to get defensive in defending my own perspective, because I'm there just to understand their perspective. So it actually is a sort of protective armor in a sort of inverse way of thinking about humility. Humility to listen. A quote from Gandhi, "It is unwise to be too sure of one's own wisdom. It is healthy to be reminded that the strongest might weaken and the wisest might err." Now I want to focus a little bit on some of the social science research that's looked at humility and what humility looks like. So from various social science studies, we know that people with a high other focus. They're really focused on other people, not focused on themselves. They are exhibiting high humility. They reduce the physical distance between themselves and another person with whom they disagree. So there is, this was actually reiterated yesterday morning on the Hidden Brain on NPR, had a series of a woman who talked about the specific experiments that they've done, where they put people in a room with someone with whom they were diametrically opposed on a particular issue, and looked at the positioning of where they sat and how close and how they aligned themselves with the other person. They also align their bodies more side by side rather than directly across from each other in opposition to each other when they engage with people with whom they disagree. They also use more inclusive language, we, us, are, as opposed to you, them, are not. Okay. People with humility are more likely to demonstrate what we call enlightened self-interest. And these are more theologians writing about how some people are able to achieve a place where others' well-being and others' needs are so inextricably tied with their own that they are the one and the same. So if you're familiar with the South African Zulu word Ubuntu, is the idea that your destiny is inextricably tied with my destiny. We are connected together. And so this is this idea of enlightened self-interest. Demonstrated by a number of spiritual leaders, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela come to mind to me, as well as Gandhi and others who have this sort of enlightened self-interest. There's a quote in one of Desmond Tutu's books where he talks about being imprisoned during the time of apartheid and looking at his jailers who could have been ready to torture him. I mean, a lot of that was done during that time when people were detained in law enforcement, and looking at his jailers and asking, what have we done? What have we done to diminish their humanity that they would act in such a way toward me? Wow, that's humility. That's not accusing the other side. That's saying, what have I done that has diminished the humanity of other people that have put them in a position that they are acting in this particular way? And that is, I think, wise example going forward. So what does humility sound like? Again, a lot of social science studies that rate people, measure levels of humility, and then record conversations and analyze these for particular things. What they find: people with high humility speak with empathy, respect, valuing others, giving other people credit, benevolence, universalism, gentleness, equality, sharing are some of the things that come out. What does humanity feel like? Other studies say an openness to new and challenging information is part of being humble. Humanitarian and egalitarian ideals are associated with people who score high on humility. Acceptance of others' beliefs and values, even when different from your own. And by acceptance, I think means humility to listen, to try to understand another person's values and positions. Willingness to admit mistakes, acknowledge gaps in knowledge, and display flexibility and compassion. That was from another study on humility. Hilga Brown writes, keep me away from the wisdom which does not cry, the philosophy which does not laugh, and the greatness that does not bow before children. So what does it mean to bow before children, elderly, the poor, the ability challenged, the immigrant, the Muslim, the Hindu, the Jew, the Black, the Asian, the Hispanic, the transgendered, the gay, the lesbian, the bisexual, the Sudanese, the Syrian, the Iraqi, the Sioux, the prisoner, the freedom fighter, the terrorist. I imagine that some of you bristled at the idea of bowing before anyone, let alone some of the identity groups, humans with particular identities on the list that I just read. But let's take a second here. We're going to do a very, very quick little breakout group. And I want you to, in a group of about, we'll put about 4 people per group, talk about what is humility to you? How do we become humble before those with whom we disagree? What does this mean? And I'm not saying this is easy stuff. So what does humility mean to you? And we're only going to take about 2 to 3 minutes in the groups and then come back to the full session. So watch your screen just a moment. I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to put you in groups if I can find where's my menu at the bottom of the screen. Okay, I am not seeing the opportunity for me to do breakout groups, so I think that must be
Susan, can you help us do a breakout group?
Susan and Judy. If you can put people into groups about 3 or 4.
Yes, I can do that. Do you want me to you're saying you want me to just split it automatically into 4 groups?
3 or 4 persons per group.
Okay. Sorry, I move things around while I'm working. Let me see how to do this.
If you want to make me host for a minute, I can do it, and then you can take away my hosting capabilities.
If you know how to do it quickly, I do. I've done it a few times, but I'll just make you a host real quickly.
Okay. There we go. Okay. I'm going to put you into groups. So we've got about 9 times 3, 27. Yep, 3 to 4 people per group. You'll see a note on your screen, and I will be able to talk to you in your group. So I'll tell you when it's time to come back. And again, just probably 2 to 3 minutes, and make sure that everybody in your group has a little bit of time to talk. What is humility to you? So off you go. Just click on your screen and meet your group partners. Okay, if you're still on the screen and you have not joined your group, please click on your group because there are people waiting for you.
Deidre, that worked well.
Excellent. So we've got everybody back.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and leave you in host mode.
Okay.
Well, no, actually, why don't you transfer that back to me in case somebody comes into the class? I'll need that control so it doesn't interrupt your presentation.
I think it's got to be shifted back on your end.
Okay.
So I'm going to power forward and
Yep.
And then alert me if the net's break.
Okay.
I haven't figured it out.
I just don't want it to interfere when you're talking, but that's totally great.
Thank
Deidre,
you.
we're seeing your screen now. We're seeing PowerPoint again.
Excellent. All right. So let's shift our conversations just a little bit from humility to expanding it to humility to listen. What does it mean to listen? Unfortunately, listening, we're terrible at this. As a culture, we do not do it well. The Buddhists talk about monkey brain, where you have all of these thoughts going through your head at one time. And that's very characteristic of many Americans when we try to listen. Is that our idea is racing, we're making our grocery list, we're thinking of something else. We are multitasking, doing something else entirely. So you are all in my little confidential loyal in group here, and you cannot tell my spouse this, but often when he comes home and he's talking about his day and things that have happened, and I'm working on the computer or doing some grading or something else, I'm not listening. And I realized several minutes into this that I haven't heard a thing that he said. This is not a good thing. This speaks to very, very poor listening skills. So it takes focus. And in a multitasking culture, we can't multitask. All the neuroscience evidence is that we think we can do it, but we can't really do it. We need to focus on one thing at a time. Another thing that we do that when we're supposed to be listening, particularly when it's somebody with whom we disagree, is that our mind is racing to construct our own argument, our own response to, as soon as we get a chance to talk, man, we're going to nail them with this argument, and we're going to nail them with that argument, but we're not really listening to what they're saying in the first place. We're not seeking to understand what has led them to this position that they're taking. Rather, we're already constructing our own argument. So what often results in our conversations is what I call serial monologues. And you see this in large groups too, where you're supposed to be having a discussion, and what you see is a serial monologue because no one is connecting with what was said with the person that just spoke before them because they are going to present their point of view. So, man, we've got some work to do, and we're going to practice some listening. Part of this idea of listening involves trust. We have to have trust. We have to have trust that others will listen and believe us when we speak. When we tell our story, we need people to believe our story, and we have to trust that they will believe it. And also, when we hear somebody else's story, we have to put our judgment on hold and say, what if this story is true? What if this story is true, rather than immediately going to all the reasons why we don't think that is true. And I think this is most poignantly demonstrated by a little clip after the Charleston shooting by Jon Stewart, the host of The Daily Show. So I'm going to show you a little clip here. So bear with me again while we... switch screens. Here we go.
One job, and it's a pretty simple job. I come in the morning, and we look at the news.
We can hear you, but not see the.
No. Okay. Hang on just a moment. I know what our problem is.
Now we're seeing it.
Excellent. Thank you, Judy. Okay. Judy, are we back on the
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
So Jon Stewart in this clip does such a powerful job of pointing to what we as a large society in the United States have not listened to. We have not trusted the stories of our Black brothers and sisters when they say, this is racism. Do you hear my story? This is what I'm experiencing. And this was just yet another example of dismissing this shooting as something other than what it was. This was, again, racism rearing its ugly, violent head. So this idea of trusting our own stories and trusting that somebody is going to believe our story from our experience, and also trusting the stories that we hear, putting that denial aside to really fully listen and engage in that story. So this idea of sharing a story is making the invisible, what's in our heads, what's in our minds, what's in our heart, visible. We're bringing it out. We're bringing out what perhaps has been silenced in our experience, and we're letting it be heard. And listening to stories is a sacred act of love into the window of the soul of another person. They are trusting you with their story. A story is something incredibly human and valuable and sacred. And so we need to respond to stories as such. So how do we do this with listening? How do we work on our listening skills and listen with humility so that we can fully seek to understand another person, even if we disagree with them? So this is the Chinese character, the Chinese language character for listening. And it's beautiful because it includes all sorts of aspects of listening that we don't often think about. So for example, to be present is to listen, to be present with somebody else. Another is to see, to use our eyes when listening, to read nonverbals, to see a person's emotional responses, to see a person in all of their humanity, rather than as an enemy or as an other that we put outside of our loyal in-group. To focus, oh my, this is one we really have challenges with, isn't it? How do we focus? How do we mindfully get into a place without distraction where I'm really trying to understand what you're saying, to understand what you're thinking, what you're feeling, rather than, again, calculating my own counter argument in my head of how I'm going to respond to you. The idea of listening with our hearts, so that we're feeling, we're engaging in empathy and connection and human connection with another person when we listen. To hear, engaging our ears is typically what we as North Americans think about when we think about listening. And so I'm just listening to words coming into my ear. I'm getting a direct translation as to exactly what that person is thinking or feeling. It's not the case, is it? So the ears are one small part of it, because we also have to think. And we have to think about, how am I interpreting what I'm hearing versus how is the person intending this meaning to be interpreted? Those are often two very, very different things. So thinking, reflecting upon what we're listening to. So listening, when we really engage it well, involves perspective taking, taking the perspective of another person, trying to understand the world through their lens, through their worldview. Withholding judgment, ooh, that's a tough one, isn't it? When you're listening, you shouldn't be judging and evaluating. There's a time for that later. You want to challenge somebody's position, there's a time for that later, but for right now, you're suspending that evaluation and judgment. That's difficult to do, and it's not something we as a culture do well. Verbals and nonverbals. We're reading the person and their with our eyes as well as with our ears. We're listening for what is said and what is unsaid in the story. We're also, when we're listening, engaging and being mindful of our own nonverbals. So maintaining eye contact, leaning in when somebody is speaking to us or disclosing something that is very heartfelt or perhaps difficult for them, to lean in, to lessen the distance between us when we are listening to another person. So your very stance and position of your body becomes involved in listening. Paralanguage are the non-fluencies that we issue in listening, like the yeah, whoa, oh my, oh goodness, yeah. So they're like nonsensical words, non-fluencies, but they are valuable to affirm the other person, say, I am here, I am present. I am present for you in this moment. And that's the role of that paralanguage and how important it is. I remember when I gave my first professional research presentation at a national conference. I'd just come out of my master's program and I was starting my PhD program, and my master's was in Texas and I was living in Iowa at the time. And I showed up and I was terribly nervous, because the thing that happens in academic conferences is after you present your research, a respondent comes and tears you apart publicly in front of the group. So very anxiety provoking situation. And I remember looking out into the audience, and here I am, a lowly graduate student and terrified, looking at the audience, and there is my master's thesis advisor sitting right in the center of the auditorium, and everything I said, he would nod. And I remember just focusing on that face and how valuable that affirmation, that presence was, that I was being heard, I was being affirmed, I was being listened to in that particular context. So those things that we do with our own bodies as our role of listener are incredibly important. The last one is silence. That it's okay that we can lean into silence. We are a culture that does not tolerate even a millisecond of silence. We have to do things in order to fill that space. But when we're listening, to be able to reflect, to be able to think, to just slow things down a little bit, that it's okay. We should be silent in that listening mode, because we're reflecting, we're thinking, we're focusing on what another person is saying. So we are going to, let me check time here real quick. Okay, we can do this. We are going to do a couple of exercises before we're done today. And I want to give you a chance to practice this idea of mindful listening and focusing in your listening, practicing that ting, the Chinese character where you're using all of your senses in a listening context. Now, if we were face-to-face and in person to person, I would put you in chairs that look like that little visual on the slide, the tete-a-tete chair, where you're not looking at each other, but you're close in proximity to each other. So what I want you to do, I'm going to put you into rooms of 2 people each. And if you end up with a third person, just do the exercise with 3 people. If we have an uneven number, I want you to pick one issue. I want you to take less than 10 seconds to pick this issue. Really doesn't matter what the issue is, but an issue that's important to you this election. Maybe it's immigration, maybe it's abortion, maybe it's gun control, maybe it's the economy. Okay, pick one issue. And you don't know perhaps who this other person is that you will be in conversation with. I want you to look away on your computer so you're not looking at each other during this exercise. So you can drop your gaze, turn your computer just a little bit to the side so that you're not looking at each other, as if you were sitting in these tete-a-tete chairs. I want you to focus just on hearing the other person, just listening. I'm going to send you a message when you get in your group. So I'll give you 10 seconds or so to come up with an issue. I'm going to say start when I broadcast to your group, and you've got 60 seconds. You are going to, given that issue, say a single word. If your issue is immigration, I might say workers. I might say a phrase, children in cages. I might respond with silence. It doesn't make any difference. You don't have to take turns in this exercise. Somebody could take several turns. There could be silence for several seconds while you reflect and think. This is free association. What words or simple phrases come to mind when you think about this particular issue that you've chosen? Single word, simple phrase, 2 to 3 words. Not a story, not an elaboration, not a defense of your position, single word. The other person might respond with 2 or 3 words. The other person might respond with another single word that comes to mind. You're focusing, you're reflecting, another word that makes you think of. That's the extent of your interaction, and you're focused on listening. I will send you a message to your group that says stop in 60 seconds. And then I want you to take about 60 more seconds with your partner. Don't talk about the issue. talk about the process. What was this like for you to really focus on hearing and hearing these words or phrases and what the other person was saying? What was this experience, this process like for you? Okay, so I am going to put you into breakout groups with the partner. Assign participants to 15 rooms. Open all rooms. All right, your screen should have an invitation to join the room. Go to the room, give you a few minutes to pick your topic, and then I'll say start. Okay, looks like we are all back. Hold on just a moment. I'll share screen with you again. I want to share a recent discovery in all the years I've been teaching communication skills and about listening. It was only within the last few months that I discovered, where I read someplace, that if you take the word listen and you rearrange the letters, you get silent. Isn't that beautiful? What a great reminder to us when we think about mindful, intentional listening, where we're really focused on one thing. Before we end today or go to questions, I do want to get through some reflective listening skills that I think are critically important to take your listening to another level, to keep these things in mind. Reflective listening, sometimes people talk about paraphrasing or active listening. Reflective listening is a little more specific in terms of the research and the substance behind it. The ideas, some pointers for reflective listening that I want you to try to practice are: one, using as few words as possible when you are reflecting back to a person that you're listening to. You don't have to say everything. You don't have to take as much time as they've said to tell their story. You need to think using very concise words and phrases to reflect back. Sometimes, to get a person to talk more about something, you can simply say one word and phrase it as a question. Civility, if they said something about civility, and that's enough to prompt the person to talk more and explain more about what they meant about civility. Use another person's words whenever possible. So reflect those words back to them. So if they're using particular phrases and particular terminology, use those same words back, because that is conveying to them that they are being heard. Be specific. So rather than saying, oh yeah, I hear you, yep, I understand, be specific as to what you've heard. I hear you saying that you agree with the president on such and such an issue. Okay, be specific. Next one is to keep the focus on what has already been said. Wait until later. Right now, you are engaged in listening. Your sole role and purpose is to understand what the other person is saying and where they are coming from. So wait to move beyond what the person has already said. So you don't want to say something like, so given what you've said, you would support such and such a policy. No. You're moving the conversation on in a new direction to a new point. We're not doing that right now. You are focused. So my graphic of the whoa, it's like pulling the reins on a horse, pulling back, saying, no, you're not going there yet about what you want to talk about. You're actually listening to the person that you're speaking with. Okay. Remain neutral, non-evaluative. Wait to say that you agree, or to analyze what they've said, or to interpret what they said. So you're pulling the reins back on the horse. You're resisting that need to analyze and interpret and say what you think. I agree, I don't agree. You wait on that, because right now your sole focus and role is to reflect back what you're hearing to try to understand. You can ask questions for clarity. So are you saying that you agree with the president on if this is what they've already said? So you can ask questions for clarity, but the rest of the questions that you want to ask are going to take the conversation in a new direction and about what you want to talk about or about your position. You're not going there yet. So it's whoa, hold back on the reins, reflective listening. Your sole purpose is to reflect back. Okay, a couple of reminders on listening. We listen selectively. We hear what we want to hear and we ignore the rest. We hear the things that we agree with, or if it's a person that we know we disagree with, we only hear the things that we disagree with and not the things that we might actually share in common. That any story, there are going to be multiple interpretations of that story. Anything that's said, there are multiple interpretations. So it's important to check in with listening. Am I hearing what you intend to say? Okay. What you hear affects the construction of the subsequent conversation. So what you think you heard is going to affect how you respond and where the rest of the conversation goes. And so we want to try to be as accurate as possible in terms of hearing what the person is intending for us to hear. And this idea of focusing on the other person, not yourself. So you're not constructing your own argument. You're not associating it with your own experiences. You're not trying to contradict the person in your mind. You're focusing wholly, intently on the other person. So we can do this in a limited amount of time. I am going to put you into 3-person groups to do a quick exercise practicing courage and humility. So speaking with courage and humility to listen, to kind of wrap up what we've talked about today. Going to be 3 people in a group. And if you only have 2 people, go with the speaker and the listener, again, depending on how we are divisible by 3. The speaker, choose the person who's going to speak in your group and who's going to be the listener, and for the 3rd person, who's going to be the observer. And an ideal world, we'd have time for everybody to take each one of these roles, but we don't have quite that much time today because I want to give some time for questions at the end. The speaker, I'm going to give you 60 seconds. I'm going to type to your group, start. Pick a position, pick an issue that's important to you. You have 60 seconds to talk uninterrupted. Nobody else is going to say anything. You've got 60 seconds. What is your position on the issue? What experiences have you personally had that have led you to this position? So you're speaking from your own experience. What messages have you gotten from your friends, your family, different community groups about your position on this issue? Okay, what's your position on an important issue? What experiences have you had? What messages, input have you gotten from other people in your life about your position on this issue? Okay, I'm going to say stop at 60 seconds. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of a sentence, you stop as soon as you get my message to stop, because we have to stay on time, and it also forces you to be concise and abide by the rules of the exercise. Then it is the listener's turn. I'm going to give the listener 20 seconds to use these reflective listening skills and try to reflect back what the speaker has said. The speaker then has about 30 seconds to give any feedback to the listener. Wow, you picked that out of what I said. That's not what I meant. Or, wow, you really emphasized this. That was, yeah, I said that, but that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was this. Or, wow, I've never felt so reflected and authentically listened to ever in my life, perhaps as your experience. So the speaker gives some opportunity for feedback. And again, I will be sending you these messages so you know when to shift gear and what to do next. Then we'll have a few seconds for the observer to talk about some observations about the courage to speak and the humility to listen. What are your insights about how we can use courage to speak and humility to listen to cultivate civility? Okay, so that's the observer role. And again, I will send you these messages throughout. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. For the listener, I will see if I can put up those tips for reflective listener at the time that you go on as well. And I am going to put you into breakout groups of 3 people. And if you have 2 people in your room, then you are a speaker and a listener, and you can both do the observation role. And off you go. All right, looks like we have almost everybody back. We are running out of time. So what I'm going to do is a quick summary, your homework for next week. And then if you could just take a second to, on the chat line, send in your questions to Judy, and I will start with those questions at the beginning next week. And that will actually be a good review for us of what we've covered this week before we go into next week's conversation. And we'll start with those questions next week. So please put those in the chat line. I'm going to share my screen with you one last time. Just a summary of what we've talked about today. So the humility to listen, the courage to speak, reminders, speak concisely, choose your words with care, speak your truth, tell your own stories, trust in others' stories, listening with ting, focusing on others, not ourselves when we engage in conversation and dialogue, and seeing, hearing, feeling, practicing those things that are associated with humility. So you guys all want homework, right? So this week, I want you to practice two things with listening. One is that listening mindfully, and you might want to do 2 separate times that you do this. Focusing on focusing your attention, aligning your body, closing the distance between you and another person. Really try to engage perhaps somebody that you don't agree with. Practice these skills. Using the inclusive language, holding another person's story as sacred. Tell me, what experiences have you had that have led you to take this position on this particular issue? Also, try practice listening reflectively. How do you reflect back what you're hearing? Few words as possible. Repeat the words and phrases that a person uses. Be specific, be neutral, non-judgmental. Focus on what's already been said, where your full focus and attention is on merely understanding what the other person has said. So that's your homework for the week. Please do put your questions in chat, and we will start with those next time. And we are done just in the nick of time. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me today. It's always a pleasure to interact with HASP and to talk about things that I'm passionate about in terms of communication and communication studies. So I hope to see you next week. Same time, same place.
Thank you so much. Let's thank, yeah, that was wonderful. Judy, if you and Deidre would like to stay on after.
Yes, I'll stay on.
Exit. Awesome. We'll just kind of debrief, and you can report back on what you see in the chat. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Deidre, you are a master at Zoom breakout rooms.
Oh,
that is really amazing. You do it quickly and on the fly, and that's yes, you've had some practice, I think.
I've had some practice this semester. Had to learn it by necessity.
Yeah. I saw some things that I hadn't seen previously, which is being able to just kind of chat to all the breakout rooms. So I'm gonna have to do some practicing about that. That's great. Yeah. So Miss Judy,
we had no chats really to the entire group. I'm getting one right now though. Andre, please email the last slide to each of us so we can have the instructions. Can you email that slide? And that means maybe email it to Susan, and Susan can send it to the list of all the people who are participants. Can that work, Susan?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send out, I was going to say I'll send out an evaluation, but the course evaluation will go out at the end of your series. So I will make sure that I send that out to everyone.
Excellent.
Okay, other than that, there was one question about the message of ting. What I summarize again, and I think I answered the person by saying that it means not listening just with your ears, but also with your heart and your mind. It had several nuances to it. You might want to put the ting slide again next week, just as a kind of transition from this week to next week, and then briefly mention that again. But other than that, there were a few individual comments to me about various things, but no one, except for now, Andre, emailed the slide to the entire group.
Mhm.
And the rest of them were just comments to me here and there.
Okay.
When we have just the three of us together, there's one other item I want to bring up. So we'll wait for the others to leave the room. Andre, oh, she's muted right now.
Let me grab that slide while I'm thinking about it.
So Judy, you're saying we're gonna close everybody else out? Because I can start doing that.
Yeah, right. I think so. I think at this point, that's the thing to do.
Yeah, if someone does not, so some people might have already left there and just not logged out. So I'm gonna start logging you out unless you have something to say and you can unmute yourself. So bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It's gonna take me a minute because I have to do everybody individually.
Do you know who that slash bar is?
No.
If you can find that out, that would be interesting.
Oh, they just logged out. Oh no, they're.
It's still on my screen.
I have a feeling they walked away. Okay, I think that we are.
Let's see, I still see Jan's iPad. Okay, and let me, the other one is just my other screen. Kim's here with us.
Hi.
Kim's here with us. One comment I got from